Pick that up, sweetheart." That is what Dr. Whitfield said 48 hours before two naval officers in dress blues would storm Cedar Creek Medical demanding the location of Spectre 6. Margaret Walsh moves through the night shift trauma bay in Savannah with methodical precision, her movements economical, purposeful, like someone who has learned that excess motion wastes oxygen and time. Fluorescent lights hum overhead, that low electric drone that becomes white noise after the third consecutive night shift. Antiseptic burns her nostrils, sharp and clean, a chemical signature she associates with sterile fields from Baghdad to Bethesda. She's been at Cedar Creek Medical for exactly 22 days. Long enough to memorize the supply closet locations, short enough that most of the staff still calls her the new nurse. Long enough to start tracking. Short enough to remain invisible. Other nurses notice small things about Margaret Walsh without knowing what those details mean. The surgical scars on her forearms, thin white lines like a map of something terrible, visible when she scrubs in for procedures. The way she assesses a room upon arrival, eyes moving systematically from exits to equipment to potential hazards, counting invisible angles like someone calculating angles of fire. The tarnished military challenge coin she unconsciously rolls between her fingers during the quiet 3 a.m. moments when the trauma bays hold only sleeping patients and the hospital breathes in a different rhythm. That coin is old, worn smooth by 18 years of nervous habit, stamped with an insignia that no one here recognizes. She keeps it in her scrub pocket, right side, where her dominant hand can reach it without thinking. She's been here monitoring one specific person. Dr. Whitfield. The information arrived 3 weeks ago in a classified briefing, Cedar Creek Medical, Savannah, Georgia. Investigates suspicious cardiac patient deaths coinciding with Dr. Whitfield's experimental procedures. The billing records tell a story in numbers: 3 deaths in 4 months, insurance claims averaging $847,000 per case, typical cardiac interventions billing at $284,000. Someone in billing noticed the pattern first, some accountant with institutional memory who flagged the anomaly. The hospital board buried it. Insurance companies paid without questions. But Naval Criminal Investigative Service does not bury anything. They redirect it. They embed it. Which is how Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, 8 months out of a classified assignment in the Levantine Theater, finds herself wearing scrubs instead of a combat uniform and a name badge instead of dog tags. The tarnished coin sits heavy in her pocket as she checks the monitors in Trauma Bay 4. The patient is a grizzled construction worker admitted 6 hours ago with acute abdominal pain, appendicitis, straightforward, should be a routine appendectomy. But this bay is Dr. Whitfield's next project, which means Margaret watches his movements like she once watched rooftop positions in urban terrain. She catalogues his word choices, his billing codes, the way he orders tests that aren't medically necessary but are billable complications. The patient, name tag reads Dalton Reed, weathered face, arm scarred from decades of hard labor, watches her work with narrowed eyes. Military bearing, she thinks. She recognizes the look. His eyes track her suture technique once, then again. He doesn't ask questions. Neither does she. Not here. Not yet. The challenge coin feels warm in her pocket, worn smooth against her palm when she touches it. It's a habit from before, from operating rooms in Kandahar, from a forward operating base in Anbar province, from 18 years of military service that included everything the public knows about and nothing the public is allowed to know about. She rolls it between her fingers now, a fidget that looks nervous to the civilian staff around her. It isn't nervous. It's a metronome. It's counting. It's a reminder of who she actually is when the scrubs come off. Margaret moves to the medication dispensing station and enters her credentials. The electronic lock clicks open. She scans inventory for Whitfield's typical cardiac drugs, the ones he orders even when the patient's cardiac status doesn't justify them. The pattern emerged on day 9 of her assignment. Unnecessary medications billed as emergency interventions. Fabricated complications in the chart supporting inflated procedures. Insurance companies don't ask questions when a board-certified cardiologist says a patient needed emergency stabilization. They just pay the claims. The break room exists at the end of the south corridor. Margaret doesn't go there. She has observed that the break room is where social hierarchies establish themselves, where rumors circulate, where the unit's psychological temperature gets taken daily. The attending physicians eat in a separate break room on the 3rd floor. The nurses rotate through the general break room like inmates in a prison yard. She observed this on day 3 and has avoided it since. Instead, she takes her coffee at 2:13 a.m., standing at the medication station, reviewing digital charts. Her eyes scan Whitfield's previous cardiac cases with the clinical detachment of someone auditing a fraud scheme. 12 cases over 16 months. 8 resulted in additional procedures. 6 resulted in extended ICU stays. All billed at premium rates justified by complications that appear in the documentation but not in the actual patient outcomes. She's still holding the coffee, now cold, now undrinkable, when Whitfield enters the trauma bay corridor at 9:56 p.m., beginning his evening rounds. His white coat is pristine. His tie is silk, expensive, the color of old money. He walks the way men walk when they've never had to be afraid of anything, shoulders back, eyes scanning the staff like he's counting inventory. He's been practicing medicine in Savannah for 14 years. He has no criminal record. He has no public complaints filed against him. What he has is a brother-in-law who sits on the hospital board and a reputation for ordering the most expensive interventions in a 3-state region. His cardiac procedures generate nearly $12 million in annual revenue for Cedar Creek Medical. That makes him functionally untouchable. That is what he believes. That is the miscalculation. Margaret has already observed the cafeteria during her 3-week assignment. She knows the timing, the rhythms, the social geography of a hospital food service space at peak meal hours. The cafeteria is where power gets displayed. The cafeteria is where the night shift staff takes their dinner break at exactly 11:15 p.m. because that's when the ER slows down, when the emergency department reaches the statistical minimum of critical cases, when you have exactly 42 minutes before the night shift accelerates again. She's there on night 22, sitting at a corner table with her meal, grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, water, because the fuel matters and the appearance of normalcy matters more. The voice carries across the cafeteria with practiced volume. I'll give it a week. Whitfield is standing with 3 other physicians, 2 male, 1 female. They laugh at something he's said. $50 says the new night shift nurse quits. She's got that look, you know? Like she's toughing it out. These older nurses, they can't handle modern medicine. They come in thinking experience matters anymore. Margaret continues eating. The fork moves to her mouth at exactly the same pace. Her jaw does not clench. Her breathing does not change. The other diners have already looked away, the unconscious response of institutional hierarchy. When the attending physician speaks, the nurses do not stare. They become invisible. They become background. But Margaret has been trained to notice what others miss. She notes that Dr. Whitfield's voice carries a performative cruelty, designed for an audience. She catalogues the way his colleagues smile without warmth. She understands that this moment is not about her. It's about dominance. It's about establishing pecking order. It's about reminding the nursing staff that they occupy a subordinate position in the institutional power structure. She finishes her meal. She places her napkin on the tray. She stands, moving with deliberate calm toward the exit. The coin rolls between her fingers in her pocket, smooth and warm and ancient. Whitfield's elbow finds her as she passes his table. The collision is angled, calculated, the kind of accident that happens when someone leans back at precisely the wrong moment. Her dinner tray, still holding her water glass, clatters against her hip. Water splashes across her scrubs. The tray tips. The glass drops. It doesn't break. It rolls across the cafeteria floor with the sound of glass on tile, that particular acoustic signature of something delicate losing its stability. The room goes quiet. The room actually stops its background noise and goes quiet. Whitfield straightens, his face arranged in an expression of mock concern. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry." His voice drips with insincerity. "I didn't see you there." Are you all right? Margaret stands motionless, water dripping from her scrubs, her jaw set but otherwise composed. Her hands are steady. They have been steady in operating rooms under mortar fire. They have been steady while performing field surgery on soldiers who would not survive if her hands shook. They are steady now. Next time, watch where you're standing, Whitfield continues, and the other physicians laugh again, that particular laugh of people who know they are part of an institutional machine powerful enough to dismiss any complaint, any consequence, any accountability. He turns back to his colleagues as Margaret bends to retrieve her tray. The water is spreading across the tile floor in an expanding circle. She reaches for the glass. She reaches for the spilled napkins. And that is when Whitfield drops the patient chart. It falls from his hand with deliberate carelessness, landing on the floor directly where Margaret is crouching. The chart slides toward her feet, its pages spreading slightly, medical information visible, the patient's name printed clearly on the folder. Whitfield smirks. It's a small expression, just the corner of his mouth tightening, but it carries complete certainty that he owns this moment, owns this space, owns the authority to reduce a nurse to the status of someone who picks up his garbage. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he says. Margaret's jaw tightens. Her hands pause for exactly 1 second. The world seems to compress into that moment, the fluorescent lights of the cafeteria, the smell of institutional food, the weight of the challenge coin in her pocket that represents 18 years of service in an organization that doesn't exist in any official capacity. She bends. She picks up the chart. Her hands move with mechanical precision, gathering the scattered pages, restoring order from the deliberate chaos Whitfield has created. The other nurses watch without watching, the institutional technique of bearing witness while maintaining plausible deniability. No one meets her eyes. No one acknowledges what just happened because acknowledging it would require them to take a position, and taking a position requires courage. Margaret sets the chart on Whitfield's tray. She retrieves her water glass. She straightens, her movements as controlled as a soldier standing at attention. Her voice, when she speaks, carries no emotion. "Your chart, Dr. Whitfield." The ride back to the trauma bay is 17 seconds. She walks from the cafeteria to the elevator to the 3rd floor to the nursing station. The water is still damp on her scrubs. The challenge coin is still rolling between her fingers. What Whitfield does not understand, what he cannot possibly understand, is that Margaret Walsh has survived operations that would destroy ordinary people. She has held the lives of soldiers in her hands in places where the ground itself was trying to kill you. She has established classified protocols in theaters of conflict that don't appear on any map. She has been trained by the most lethal military organization on the planet to endure, to adapt, to maintain her identity when everything around her is designed to strip it away. She is not here to quit. She is not here to cry in a supply closet. She is not here because she needs a job. She is here because somewhere in the billing records and the fabricated complications and the insurance fraud, 3 people are dead. 3 people. Billed as emergencies. Coded as complications. Buried in the bureaucracy of a hospital that doesn't want to ask questions about its most profitable physician. Margaret arrives at the nursing station and begins her notes for Trauma Bay 4. The patient in that bay, Adolton Reed, construction worker, formerly military based on his bearing, will have his appendectomy in 48 hours. Whitfield will be his surgeon. Whitfield will order unnecessary interventions. Whitfield will fabricate complications. And Margaret will be there, documenting everything with the precision of someone trained in intelligence gathering, with the patience of someone who has hunted actual threats to actual lives. The coin sits heavy in her pocket. It sits there like a promise. It sits there like a countdown. The appendectomy had been scheduled since dawn. Margaret reviewed the chart at the nurse's station. Daniel Reeves, 58, Army Ranger, tattoo visible even in the pre-op photos, scheduled for acute appendicitis with suspected perforation. She'd pulled his labs herself, white count elevated at 18.2, C-reactive protein spiking, lactate climbing toward 4. The abdomen didn't lie. The infection was already spreading. Whitfield had assigned her to assist, which meant he'd assigned her to watch. She understood the calculus now: 3 weeks of observation, every shift, every procedure, documenting which patients underwent his experimental cardiac interventions, which insurance claims came back with fabricated complications, which families were billed for procedures that never happened. The cardiac unit was his kingdom. The appendectomy was just another way to keep her occupied while his machines ran elsewhere. The operating room at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like antiseptic and copper, old familiar smells, the kind that lived in her muscle memory from 14 years ago when she'd worked in operating theaters that didn't have climate control or fluorescent lights. The surgical bay here was pristine: stainless steel tables, a ceiling of recessed lighting, the steady hum of ventilation systems designed to keep the air sterile. Reeves lay prepped and draped on the table, already unconscious under general anesthesia, his abdomen exposed in the yellow glow of the surgical field lights. The attending surgeon was Dr. Hassan, competent but methodical, the kind of physician who followed protocols exactly and never deviated. Margaret stood across from him, gloved and ready, her hand steady as surgical steel. She'd rehearsed this 1,000 times: the anticipation, the reading of the room, the knowledge of what would happen before it happened. Surgeons operated with their eyes. Margaret operated with something deeper: prediction born from trauma, from 18 years of watching bodies fail in places where there was no backup, no second opinion, only the choice between saving a life and letting it slip away. The incision went in cleanly. Hassan made the initial cut with the scalpel, and Margaret was already thinking 3 steps ahead. He would retract the peritoneum. He would locate the appendix. And then he would discover that the infection had progressed beyond what the imaging had shown. The lactate levels had told her that story. She'd already visualized the rupture, the spillage, the timeline. "Bovie," Hassan said, and Margaret had it ready before he finished the word. The electrocautery pencil passed into his hand like she'd been waiting for him to ask. She knew his rhythms now: his hesitation before difficult sections, the micro-pause where he assessed tissue viability, the moment where he'd need retraction and counter-retraction simultaneously. Her second hand was there, adjusting the retractor, creating space without him having to ask. The surgical field opened like an anatomy textbook, precise and bloodless. Then Hassan's eyes widened. The appendix was dark purple, weeping. Ruptured. The peritoneal cavity was flooded with inflammatory fluid and bacterial contamination. What should have been a 30-minute procedure had just become a crisis. "Irrigation," Hassan said, his voice still controlled but tighter now. Margaret was already prepping the saline, the tubing, the vacuum suction. The room's energy shifted, the anesthesiologist leaned forward, watching vitals more intently, the surgical tech moved faster. Reeves's blood pressure was holding at 118/76, but Margaret could see the subtle signs: the beginning of metabolic acidosis, the early compensation for septic shock. Time had become elastic and dangerous. Hassan began meticulous irrigation of the abdominal cavity, flushing out the infected material. Margaret suctioned, anticipated, moved. Her hands were a separate consciousness. They knew when he would need the suction adjusted, when he would need more irrigation, when he would need her to maintain traction while he worked on the most contaminated section. She'd learned this skill in a field hospital in Helmand Province where there was 1 surgeon and sometimes 8 wounded, where the difference between life and death was the assistant who could read the surgeon's body language and respond before the need was voiced. The sutures came next. Hassan had already removed the appendix, and now the critical part: closing the stump, ensuring complete hemostasis, preventing future infection. He reached for the needle driver, and Margaret was already threading the suture, a 4.0 absorbable on a curved needle. But instead of waiting for Hassan to suture in his standard running closure, Margaret had already begun layering the closure with precision that made Hassan pause. She started with a modified horizontal mattress stitch, the kind used in field surgery when speed and structural integrity mattered more than cosmetic results. The knots were tight, efficient, spaced exactly to prevent tension and leakage. The stitch pattern was distinctive: 2 passes through the tissue, alternating sides, creating a box stitch configuration that distributed tension across a wider tissue plane. It was faster than Hassan's usual technique and structurally superior for contaminated wounds. It was also unmistakably military trauma surgery. It was the stitch pattern taught only to Special Operations combat medics at the Joint Special Operations Medical Course in Fort Liberty. Hassan watched her hands for 3 seconds, then said nothing. His eyes moved back to the field. Margaret completed the closure in 42 seconds, her movements economical and precise, muscle memory responding to questions her mind had been trained never to answer. Hassan made no comment. He simply checked her work, nodded once, and moved on to closure of the peritoneum. But Margaret caught the glance he exchanged with the anesthesiologist. They'd both seen something unusual. They both knew better than to ask questions in the operating room. The case ended at 11:11 a.m. Reeves was moved to recovery, his vitals stable, the septic shock managed, his appendix gone and the infection cleaned. It was a successful surgery. It was also a breach. In the recovery room, Margaret checked his vitals every 15 minutes as protocol demanded. Reeves regained consciousness slowly, fighting the anesthesia's grip, his eyes unfocused. The morphine drip was running at 2 milligrams per hour. His blood pressure was 121/79. His heart rate was steady at 72. By every objective measure, he was stable. By every other measure, he was about to become a problem. Reeves's eyes focused on her face, then drifted down to his abdomen where the dressing lay. Under the transparent film, her sutures were visible, the distinctive box pattern, tight and efficient, absolutely unmistakable to anyone who'd received field medicine training. His hand reached out and gripped her wrist with surprising strength for a man still drowsy from anesthesia. "I've seen that stitch pattern before," he whispered, his voice hoarse from the intubation tube. "Baghdad. You were there." His eyes searched her face. "That's a SOCOM stitch. You're Special Forces medical, aren't you?" Margaret's expression didn't change. There was no heat in her face, no surge of adrenaline, no visible reaction. Only the slightest pause, less than a heartbeat, but enough. Her training was to never confirm, never deny, never expose the cover. The cover was everything. The cover was the mission. But Reeves was holding her wrist, and his eyes held the unmistakable recognition of a soldier who'd been sewn up by hands like hers. "You need rest, Mr. Reeves," Margaret said quietly. Her voice had dropped half an octave. Not hostile, just authoritative in a way that suggested the conversation was ending. She reached for the fall line with her free hand and adjusted the morphine drip slightly upward. The medication would deepen his sedation, pull him back under the water where field surgery terminology couldn't follow. "You don't learn that technique in nursing school," Reeves continued, but his eyes were already losing focus, the morphine taking effect. "Only Special Operations medics stitch like that. What are you really doing here?" Margaret leaned close, her voice barely audible. "My job is keeping you alive. That's all you need to know." She adjusted his blanket, checked the foresight, noted the time in his chart. 12:04 p.m. Morphine dose increased. Patient stable. Sleeping. She turned to leave, aware with the precision of long training that her cover had developed its first visible crack. In the hospital world, cracks spread. They were noticed. They were questioned. The stitch pattern would be noted on Hassan's surgical summary. Hassan would mention it to colleagues. Word traveled in hospitals like blood through veins, fast and inevitable. But the real danger wasn't in the OR. It was in the security office, where cameras had captured every movement of her hands for the entire appendectomy. Dr. Whitfield sat alone in the video review room at 1:15 p.m., the monitor in front of him glowing with the surgical feed. He'd requested the footage after Hassan had made an offhand comment in the hallway, "Your new nurse has interesting surgical technique. Where'd she train?" The comment had been nothing. The implication was everything. Whitfield rewound the footage to the suturing sequence and played it again. Frame by frame, he watched Margaret's hands move through the modified mattress stitch. The efficiency of movement. The precision of knot placement. The absolute lack of hesitation. The stitch pattern itself, the same pattern used in every special operations medic training course in the U.S. military. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled under his chin. "Just a nurse," he said quietly to the empty room. The words weren't a statement. They were a question being revised. He picked up his phone and scrolled through the Cedar Creek Medical employee directory until he found Margaret Walsh's reference section. 3 previous employers. All listed as traveling nurse positions. All vague. All with no geographic specificity. He cross-referenced the dates: Baghdad, Iraq, March 2008 to November 2010. Helmand Province, Afghanistan, January 2012 to August 2014. And for other locations, all of them theaters of combat operations. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Whitfield closed the file and set the phone down very carefully on the metal desk. Then he stood up and walked out of the security office without saying a word to anyone. But his mind was already moving through the calculation. Whoever Margaret Walsh really was, she wasn't a traveling nurse. And the question of what she was actually doing at Cedar Creek Medical, auditing his cardiac unit, learning his patterns, documenting his procedures, had suddenly become urgent enough to move him from casual dismissal to active countermeasure. He had 23 people on his payroll in the cardiac unit. 3 were on his personal retainer. He had documented connections to the hospital board chairman through a consulting contract worth $400,000 annually. And he had a private investigator on his personal speed dial, a former FBI agent named Caldwell who specialized in making inconvenient people's credentials disappear. The calculation took him 14 seconds. The phone call took him 6 minutes. The calculation took him 14 seconds. The phone call took him 6 minutes. Dr. Whitfield sat in his private office on the 4th floor of Cedar Creek Medical, door locked, rewinding the surgical footage frame by frame. Her hands. The stitch pattern. The way she'd anticipated the bleeder before the attending surgeon even noticed the blood pressure drop. Normal nurses don't move that way. Normal nurses don't know to position retractors at that angle. Normal nurses don't carry themselves like they've held someone's intestines together while mortar fire shook the operating table. He reached for his phone. The first call went to Chairman Bancroft at the hospital board. Whitfield had done him a favor 3 years ago, kept quiet about a minor substance issue, made some files disappear, the kind of thing chairmen remember. "I need a personnel inquiry initiated immediately," Whitfield said, his voice smooth as wound sutures. "One of our new nurses. Margaret Walsh. I have concerns about her credentials and her behavior in the OR. Unauthorized decision-making during the appendectomy. Questioned my medical judgment. I want an internal investigation." Bancroft owed him. Bancroft would move fast. The second call went to 3 references listed on Margaret's application. Whitfield had a nursing administrator make the calls, official verification requests, nothing unusual. The first reference answered cheerfully and confirmed Margaret's employment. The second reference paused. Too long. Said something vague about her being very competent but seemed uncomfortable. The third reference wasn't picking up. Whitfield's pulse quickened. Rehearsed references. That's what liars used. The third call went to Marvin Cross at Cross Security Investigations. Whitfield paid him $8,000 a year for discreet background checks on staff members who concerned him. "I need deep background on Margaret Walsh. New hire, 3 weeks, RN credentials from Duke. I need employment history, military service if any, prior addresses, references verified, the works. 72 hours if possible." Cross had done this before. He didn't ask questions. Whitfield leaned back in his ergonomic chair and stared at the frozen frame of Margaret's face during the appendectomy. Her jaw. The absence of fear. The way her eyes tracked every monitor, every instrument, like she was reading a map she'd memorized years ago. Then he began documenting. He created a new file, Personnel Incident Report, Margaret Walsh, RN. He wrote carefully, precisely. During emergency appendectomy on the 14th of March, 2024, employee demonstrated unauthorized intervention in surgical decision-making. Questioned attending physician's medical judgment in front of surgical team. Breached chain of command protocols. Demonstrated excessive competence in trauma response that suggests possible military training exceeding scope of nursing practice. He dated it retroactively to 3 days ago. He had his billing administrator initial it. 2 witnesses made it official. Then he accelerated everything. He called his contact at the insurance company, a man named Devereaux who received payments through a shell corporation. I'm moving the billing timeline up. 3 procedures next week instead of the usual 1 a month schedule. High-risk cardiac interventions. I'll bill them as emergency complications requiring extended ICU stays, additional specialists, extended anesthesia time. Standard rate increase. Devereaux understood. They'd been doing this for 11 months. 3 patients had died. 3 patients who'd actually just needed simple medications, rest, and monitoring. But Whitfield's procedures billed at $30,000 per complication. Insurance paid. No one asked questions. Patients signed consent forms that listed possible complications. Dead patients didn't sue. 36 hours later, Cross Security called back. Your instincts are good, Cross said. His voice carried the gravel of someone who'd worked homicide before going private. Her nursing school records are genuine. Duke 2015. But there's a gap. For years between her graduation and her first listed nursing job in 2019. No employment record, no tax filings, nothing. It's like she disappeared. Whitfield's breath caught. Her references check out on paper, but when I called them directly, they seemed scripted. One of them hung up. The other one asked if she was in trouble. People don't hang up unless they're protecting something. What about military service? Whitfield asked. Checking that now. I'm submitting FOIA requests, but military records take time. If she served, especially in special forces or medical roles, those files are sealed tight. Could take weeks. Whitfield didn't have weeks. Find out faster, he said. I'll pay double. He ended the call and walked to his window. Savannah sprawled below him in the March heat, all moss and magnolias and secrets. The city was old enough to hide things. People disappeared here. Careers ended quietly. Investigations took months or years. By then, he'd have his records moved, his money transferred, his timeline reset to start fresh somewhere else. Maybe Jacksonville. Maybe Houston. Plenty of hospitals needed a good cardiac surgeon who knew how to work the billing system. What he didn't know was that Margaret had already photographed the billing transfer. She'd been in medical records at 2:17 a.m., pulling old charts for her investigation, when the file transfer notification had popped up on the unattended computer at the billing desk. 1 minute. 1 photograph. Just enough to document the offsite server address. Not enough to prove fraud, but enough to establish that something was moving. She'd sent the image to her encrypted secure server at Naval Criminal Investigative Service and flagged it for expedited analysis. The mission protocol was clear: gather evidence, photograph documentation, and prepare extraction if cover became compromised. Her cover was compromised. The suspension notice arrived Friday afternoon, delivered by Human Resources, a woman named Cheryl who wouldn't make eye contact. You're suspended pending investigation effective immediately, the notice said. Reason: falsified credentials and unauthorized security intervention during emergency surgical procedures. You will surrender your badge and employee ID. Please do not return to Cedar Creek Medical premises pending resolution of the inquiry. Margaret held the notice in her hands that had performed emergency surgical airway management in a Humvee under fire, hands that had sutured traumatic wounds in field conditions with trembling patients and steady fingers. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She simply folded the notice and placed it on the desk, then removed her badge and ID from her pocket and set them beside the folder. Cheryl shifted weight. The investigation should take a few weeks. We'll be in touch. Margaret nodded. Said nothing. The composure wasn't an act anymore. Composure was what happened when you'd been trained to absorb catastrophic information and keep breathing. She walked out of the hospital at 2:13 p.m., past the maternity ward where new parents stared at newborns, past the oncology wing where patients fought battles they were losing, past the ER where nurses who had nothing to hide went about their lives with the luxury of normal worry. The mission was collapsing. Whitfield had made his calls. Whitfield had fabricated his files. Whitfield had alerted the insurance company and accelerated his schedule. She had 72 hours maximum before he destroyed the remaining billing records and moved his operation to another hospital in another state. She had evidence of one transfer, one photograph of one computer screen. Not enough. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service needed documentation of at least 3 fraudulent procedures, actual hospital billing codes, proof of patient harm, communication with the insurance contact. She was suspended. She couldn't access hospital records. She couldn't observe his surgeries. She couldn't photograph anything. And she was ordered to extract. Those were her instructions. If cover was blown, if the investigation became active, if hospital security was alerted, she was to withdraw immediately. The mission would pass to another operative. Someone fresh. Someone without a face the hospital staff had seen. That was the protocol. That was the military. But 3 patients were dead. Elmer Hutchins, 67, admitted for hypertension, billed for emergency cardiac complications requiring triple bypass and extended ICU stay, died of a simple drug interaction. Mrs. Chen, 54, admitted for stable angina, unnecessarily rushed into an interventional procedure she didn't need, died on the table from anesthesia complications Whitfield's negligence caused. David Portis, 41, admitted for routine monitoring after a minor cardiac event, subjected to Whitfield's experimental catheterization technique that perforated his left anterior descending artery. Dead. All of them. Margaret sat in the all-night diner at 3 a.m., the place called Ruby's off Victory Drive, the kind of diner that existed in every American city, red vinyl booths, fluorescent lights buzzing like angry insects, coffee that had been brewing since 6 p.m. and tasted like burnt copper. She'd ordered coffee and sat in a corner booth facing the entrance. Military habit. Always position yourself to see threats coming. The coffee grew cold. Rain hammered the diner windows, the kind of March rain that came sideways, aggressive and thorough. She stared at her reflection in the dark glass, hollow-eyed, age-lined, the face of a woman named Margaret Walsh who'd worked at Duke Hospital and Northwestern Memorial and 3 other institutions that didn't exist except in paperwork. The face of a woman no one knew. The face of a phantom. She reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out the tarnished military challenge coin. It was 1.75 inches of oxidized bronze, the weight of real metal, the weight of real history. On one side, the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Development Group stamped into the metal. On the other side, coordinates, 33.9 degrees north, 71.3 degrees east, Kuna Province, Afghanistan. The location of a landing zone. The place where she'd been extracted after her last classified operation. The coin had been given to her by a captain named Halloway, a man with a face like weathered granite and eyes that had seen the same things hers had seen. "You're going deep," he'd said, placing the coin in her palm. "Might be the last time you see yourself as military. Keep this. Remember." She remembered. She held the coin in her palm and thought about the extraction order sitting in her encrypted secure server, delivered at 11:43 p.m. while she was driving home from Cedar Creek Medical. "Master Chief, cover is compromised. You are authorized to extract immediately. Stand by for transport. Your mission is complete. Do not attempt further intelligence gathering. Do not attempt to access hospital systems. Do not contact hospital staff. Withdraw to safe house and await extraction team." The order was signed by NCIS Special Agent in Charge Patricia Holloway. Not a suggestion. An order. The mission was collapsing. Whitfield was destroying evidence. And she was supposed to walk away. Then her phone buzzed. A text from an encrypted number. Not Holloway. Someone else. Someone working parallel intelligence. The message was 4 words, his moving records. Now. Margaret stared at the message. Watched the 3 typing dots appear and disappear. Another message came through. Insurance contact reached out to another hospital. He's setting up new procedures. Thursday night. 3 patients. Same pattern. We need his billing server before he transfers it. The rain intensified. A semi-truck passed on the highway outside, its air horn blasting like artillery, its headlights strobing across the diner interior in rhythmic pulses. Margaret's hands didn't shake. Hands that had performed open cardiac massage on a combat casualty while helicopter rotors screamed overhead. Hands that had functioned in Baghdad with mortar fire shaking the clinic walls. Hands that could absorb any information and keep moving. She was suspended from Cedar Creek Medical. She had no badge, no access, no authority. She had a fabricated personnel file that painted her as dishonest and reckless. She had extraction orders. She had a tarnished coin and cold coffee and a mission that was dying in real time. The protocol was clear: extract, preserve the operative, live to fight another day. The truth was clearer: if she walked away now, 3 more people died. Then 3 more. Then 3 more. Whitfield would move to Jacksonville. He'd move to Houston. He'd move to Denver. He'd keep going until someone with actual evidence stopped him. By then, he'd have killed 30 people. 50 people. Maybe more. Margaret placed the coin on the diner table, let it rest there on the scarred formica, and watched it catch the fluorescent light. The bronze gleamed, old and tarnished and undefeated. In 17 years of classified operations across 4 continents, she'd never disobeyed an extraction order. She'd never refused a command. She'd never placed personal judgment above military protocol. She thought about Elmer Hutchins, who'd been admitted to Cedar Creek Medical for blood pressure management and had died on an operating table for no reason except that his surgeon wanted to pad his billing numbers by $47,000. She picked up the coin and put it back in her pocket. Then she did something that would violate every protocol, every extraction order, every military regulation that governed classified operations. She stopped being a suspended nurse and started being who she actually was. She opened her encrypted phone and sent a message to the parallel intelligence contact: "What do you need?" The response came in 11 seconds: "Hospital records. Billing server. Proof that insurance contact is colluding. Physical evidence of 1 past procedure already performed incorrectly. You have 12 hours before he transfers everything." 12 hours. No badge. No access. No legal authority. Margaret gathered her things, left a $20 bill on the table, and walked out into the Savannah rain. Behind her, the tarnished coin sat in her pocket, heavy as a promise, heavy as a violation, heavy as the weight of people she'd promised to protect. The mission wasn't over. The mission was just beginning. Friday night at Cedar Creek Medical, 11:38 p.m. The trauma bay doors exploded open like a gunshot. A 6'5" figure stormed through, 280 pounds of pure rage, wild-eyed, gripping an 8-inch kitchen knife. His brother's death was 3 days old. His brother's name was Marcus. And he knew someone at this hospital had killed him. "Where is he?" His voice shattered the fluorescent silence like a hammer through glass. "Where's the doctor who killed my brother?" Nurses scattered like startled birds. An orderly ducked behind a medication cart, his badge clattering against the metal frame. A resident backed toward the supply closet, hands raised. Security was 90 seconds away. The dispatcher had already logged the call, but 90 seconds was an eternity when a man with a knife was screaming for blood. Everyone ran. Margaret Walsh didn't. She was standing at the central station, updating a patient's chart. She set down her pen. One smooth motion. No hesitation. No fumbling. She walked directly toward him, her posture military straight, her voice calibrated to the frequency of absolute calm. "Sir, I need you to look at me." Not a request. A command delivered so quietly the machines almost swallowed it. "Just at me. What's your brother's name?" The intruder's knife hand trembled. The blade caught the harsh hospital light and threw it back like a warning. "Marcus," he choked out. "Marcus died and they said it was complications, but I know." "I know," Margaret said, still approaching, hands visible and empty, palms open. "I saw his chart. You have every right to be angry. But this knife won't bring him answers." Her breathing didn't accelerate. Her pupils didn't dilate. She moved like someone who had negotiated death before, in languages the hospital staff had never heard. She positioned her body to block his view of fleeing staff members, a tactical move so subtle only someone trained in hostage scenarios would recognize it. Her voice dropped another half octave, the kind of vocal control that made animals stop running. "Tell me about Marcus. How old was he?" 34. The intruder's knife hand lowered by 2 inches. "He had a daughter. Emma. She's 5. He was supposed to be home in 3 days. Emma needs answers. The kind this knife can't give her." Margaret took another step. "Close now." Close enough that he could smell antiseptic on her scrubs, the faint ghost of coffee from hours earlier. The kind of answers that require you alive. In a courtroom. Speaking truth. She was 60 seconds from his reach now. The knife trembled again, not from anger anymore, but from something breaking inside him. She recognized the moment, the point where rage transforms into grief, where the weapon becomes a burden instead of a solution. "Give me the knife," Margaret said, "and I promise you I will find out what happened to Marcus." Her right hand extended, fingers relaxed, no aggression in the gesture. Just an offer. Just a moment of connection between two people in a fluorescent-lit room that smelled of bleach and mortality. The intruder's face crumpled. Tears streaming. The knife wavered. And Margaret moved. Not fast. Not violent. She guided his wrist down using a technique that shouldn't exist in any nursing curriculum, a disarming method from classified hand-to-hand combat training, the kind taught to SEALs and Delta operators in concrete bunkers at Fort Bragg. The knife fell to the tile floor with a sound like a bell being silenced. She caught his arm gently, guided him to a chair, kept talking in that same steady voice until security thundered through the doors with their hands on their weapons and found her sitting beside him like a nurse comforting a frightened patient. Because that was all she was supposed to be. Just a nurse. Whitfield watched it from the security office upstairs, his face illuminated by 4 monitor screens showing the trauma bay from different angles. He rewound the footage. Played it again. Then a 3rd time. His fingers traced Margaret's movements like he was decoding a language. The way she'd positioned her body to shield the other staff. The precise angle of her arm during the disarming. The control in her breathing. The complete absence of fear. This wasn't nursing. This was something else entirely. He reached for his phone with a hand that had begun to tremble, not from anger, but from the dawning realization that he'd made a catastrophic mistake in underestimating this woman. He dialed the board chairman directly, bypassing the normal chain of command. "We have a security incident," Whitfield said, his voice carefully measured. "A nurse at this facility just used military combat techniques to disarm an armed intruder. I'm reviewing security footage now. Her movements suggest classified special forces training. Her credentials need to be investigated immediately. I'm concerned about who we've hired." The board chairman listened. Whitfield could hear the shift in tone, from administrative indifference to institutional alarm. Within 24 hours, an official inquiry was launched. Within 48 hours, Margaret's references were being contacted. Within 72 hours, she was suspended pending investigation. The charges were surgical in their precision, unauthorized security intervention and inconsistencies in employment verification. They were also, legally speaking, impossible for her to defend without revealing her actual identity, which would blow her cover, end her investigation, and allow Whitfield to destroy the evidence of his fraudulent cardiac procedures before federal prosecutors could seize them. It was checkmate. Whitfield had finally found a move she couldn't counter. Margaret sat alone in an all-night diner on Victory Drive at 3:19 a.m. The fluorescent lights hummed their tired mechanical song. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago, the surface forming a thin film of separation from reality. Untouched pie sat on a plate beside her, apple, with cinnamon sugar dusting, because she'd ordered it by habit and couldn't bring herself to eat. The tarnished challenge coin lay on the formica table in front of her. It was made from aircraft wreckage and shrapnel collected from the USS Cole bombing in Aden Harbor, year 2000. She'd been a third-class petty officer then, 26 years old, watching the recovery operations from a Navy supply vessel. The metal had been shaped and stamped by sailors in the engineering bay, and the final version had been given to the medical officer who'd coordinated triage for 117 sailors. Her name had been hand-engraved on the back in letters so small you had to squint to read them, M.A. Walsh, Hospital Corpsman. She'd been carrying it for 23 years. Her phone glowed on the table beside the coin. A text message from her commanding officer, sent 37 minutes ago, extract immediately. Mission compromised. That's an order. The next message, 2 minutes later, do you understand? Extract. She understood. Whitfield was moving records tonight. She'd seen the evidence on the secure network before her access was revoked, 17 gigabytes of files being uploaded to an encrypted cloud server registered to a healthcare management company in the Cayman Islands. By tomorrow evening, every file would be deleted from Cedar Creek Medical's systems. Every falsified billing code. Every fabricated complication. Every fraudulent procedure report. And the 3 patients he'd already killed, Marcus included, would never get justice. The rain started around 4 a.m. It hammered the diner windows like applause from an invisible crowd, drumming against the glass with the persistence of something alive. Margaret watched her reflection in the dark pane, half convinced the woman staring back was someone she didn't recognize anymore. Just a nurse, she thought bitterly. She picked up the challenge coin and turned it over in her palm. The metal was warm from her pocket. It felt heavier than it should have, weighted with the accumulated decisions of 23 years, every patient she'd saved, every comrade she'd lost, every identity she'd buried to stay alive. She made her decision in that moment, in that diner, with rain falling outside like judgment from heaven. She would violate her extraction orders. She would complete the mission. And she would do it alone. The 3 black SUVs pulled up to Cedar Creek Medical's main entrance at exactly 12:04 p.m. on a Tuesday, their tires crackling against the asphalt like distant gunfire. No sirens. No announcement. Just the precise military silence of institutional authority arriving unannounced. The vehicles parked at precise 45-degree angles to the curb, their dark-tinted windows reflecting nothing, giving away nothing. Margaret was still in the cafeteria when the boots hit the tile floor. She heard them before she saw them, the synchronized echo of dress uniform shoes striking the corridor with the metronome precision of ceremony. 2 naval officers moved through Cedar Creek Medical like blade edges cutting through water, their sleeves pressed into knife pleats, their insignia catching the fluorescent glare like small mirrors. They didn't stop at the security desk. The guard, a retired Marine gunnery sergeant named Clayton with a scar that split his left eyebrow, watched them pass and went the color of hospital walls. He knew. Something in their bearing, their economy of movement, the way they didn't ask permission, it told him everything. Clayton moved toward the administrator's office on legs that felt disconnected from the rest of his body, his radio crackling in his hand but his voice steady when he keyed it. The next words he spoke changed everything. "That's Master Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh," he announced to the assembled board members who'd been called to the administrator's office on short notice. "She's not just a nurse. She's the most decorated Special Forces medic in naval history." The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that has weight, that displaces air, that makes people hyper-aware of their own breathing. A rear admiral stood in the center of the conference table, a folder open before him, his weathered face bearing the expression of someone who had read 1,000 service records but rarely encountered one like this. Margaret stood in the doorway in her standard scrubs, her hair in its regulation ponytail, her hands empty, her face showing nothing. She might have been a ghost. She might have been made of stone. Bronze Star, the Rear Admiral read, his voice low and measured, each word a weight landing in the room. Dr. Whitfield sat at the far end of the table, his face still holding the architecture of confidence, though something in his jaw had tightened. The Admiral continued. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. 17 years of classified operations across 3 continents. Baghdad. Kandahar. Fallujah. Each location landed like a verdict. Combat medicine under fire. Trauma surgery in field conditions. 43 lives directly saved during the Sanjin Valley operation alone. The operative in the medical community knows you as Margaret Walsh, a nurse with questionable credentials and behavioral concerns. The military community knows you as Spectre 6. He looked up from the folder. Welcome home, Master Chief. Whitfield's face drained in real time, the blood retreating from his features like a tide going out. His hand moved toward his phone, a reflexive gesture born of panic, of the desperate need to call someone, to activate some failsafe, to make this stop. But there was nothing to call. Nothing to stop. The game had changed in the space of 4 sentences, and he knew it with the clarity of absolute finality. The FBI agents entered 2 minutes later. They moved with the particular patience of people holding overwhelming evidence and all the time in the world to present it. The lead agent, a woman named Sarah Chen with steel-gray eyes and a voice like a filing cabinet sliding shut, laid a folder on the conference table and didn't bother with preamble. Dr. Whitfield, we have documentation of 17 fraudulent cardiac procedures performed over an 8-month period. Total fraudulent insurance claims, $1.2 million. Unnecessary procedures directly linked to 3 patient deaths. The complications you billed for never existed. The procedures were performed solely to generate billing events. Chen's voice never changed pitch, never inflected with judgment. She was simply stating facts the way one states that water is wet. When you attempted to forge Master Chief Walsh's nursing credentials, you committed wire fraud against federal property. You also triggered federal alarms on a protected operative's cover identity. That's conspiracy, obstruction, and medical fraud resulting in death. She set down a second stack of documents. Your private investigator kept detailed notes. Your billing administrator is cooperating with prosecutors. Your calls to board chairman Sterling were recorded. Security footage shows you removing files from the hospital at 2:17 a.m. last Thursday. Chen closed the folder with the finality of a judge's gavel. You tried to destroy someone you should have left alone, Doctor. That was your mistake. Whitfield's attorney arrived within 20 minutes, a man in a suit that probably cost $3,000 and carried the confidence of someone who had won 92% of his cases. It didn't matter. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation was airtight, and the federal charges carried mandatory minimum sentences that no lawyer could talk away. The medical board moved first, license suspended immediately, pending criminal trial, effective immediately. The hospital board moved second, termination for cause, forfeiture of pension, cooperation with federal investigation or institutional liability charges. His assets were frozen to preserve restitution funds for the families of the 3 patients he had killed for billing purposes. Margaret watched from the observation window as Whitfield sat alone in the interrogation room, his white coat replaced by a plastic visitor badge, his Rolex confiscated as evidence, his hands trembling on the metal table. His career had lasted 72 hours once the truth arrived. Everything he had built through calculated humiliation and meticulous fraud, every careful manipulation and strategic phone call, had collapsed the moment he targeted someone with the resources and training to break him into component pieces and hand him to people who specialized in assembling those pieces into prosecutions. The perp walk happened at 4:16 p.m. Whitfield in handcuffs, his face angled downward, his shoulders curved inward in the posture of defeat, moving through the same cafeteria where he had made his $50 bet that Margaret would quit within a week. where he had knocked her dinner tray onto the floor and smirked, where he had tossed a patient chart at her feet and called her sweetheart. The FBI agents flanking him moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this hundreds of times. The staff who had looked away during the humiliation now stood in frozen silence, their understanding of the previous weeks crystallizing into sharp focus. That quiet woman they had dismissed. That aging nurse who had accepted abuse without visible reaction. She had been something else entirely. The next morning, the news filtered through Savannah's medical community with the speed and impact of a shock wave. Dr. Whitfield's medical license permanently revoked. Wire fraud charges carrying potential federal prison time. Conspiracy charges related to fraudulent billing. Medical malpractice suits filed by 3 families whose loved ones had died during unnecessary procedures. His house would be sold to satisfy settlements. His reputation would become a footnote in medical journals documenting surgical fraud. His future reduced to community college CPR instruction at minimum wage, teaching chest compressions on plastic dummies to students who had no idea who he was or what he had done. Margaret placed the tarnished military challenge coin on the administrator's desk at 6:33 p.m. on that Tuesday evening. The coin was weathered, its edges worn smooth from 17 years of being rolled between her fingers during tense moments and sleepless nights. It bore the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Command on one side, and on the reverse, inscribed in letters so small you had to know they were there to find them, Spectre 6. Present. The mission is complete, she said simply to the assembled administrators and security personnel. Her voice carried no triumph, no satisfaction, no relief. It carried the same steady composure it always had, but underneath, something fundamental had shifted. The mask had lifted. The role had ended. She was still Margaret Walsh, and she would always be Margaret Walsh, but Margaret Walsh was no longer just a nurse. Margaret Walsh was no longer hiding who she really was. She walked out of Cedar Creek Medical without looking back at the trauma bay where she had faced down a knife-wielding intruder while everyone else ran. She didn't pause at the cafeteria where Whitfield had made his bet. She didn't revisit the diner where she had sat alone at 3 a.m., rolling that challenge coin between her fingers and questioning everything. The Savannah sunlight hit her face as she reached the parking lot, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she breathed air that didn't taste like restraint. The Navy SUV was waiting at the curb, its engine running, its driver, a man with lieutenant insignia and eyes that had seen similar wars, nodding as she approached. She climbed into the passenger seat and the vehicle pulled smoothly into afternoon traffic, carrying a warrior toward whatever came next. Behind them, Cedar Creek Medical would continue its work of healing the broken and holding the dying. The staff would tell stories about the nurse who wasn't just a nurse. Daniel Reeves, the Army Ranger who had recognized her suture pattern, would wear his dress uniform to work the next day just so people would understand what they had failed to see. And Dr. Whitfield would teach CPR to community college students, his hand shaking as he demonstrated compression depth on a plastic chest that would never know the fear of feeling human ribs crack beneath incompetent fingers. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. Margaret Walsh had stopped watching the world's opinion of her 3 weeks ago. She had simply walked forward, past the humiliation, past the suspension, past the moment when extraction orders told her to walk away, and she had completed the mission. Not for recognition. Not for gratitude. She had completed it because completing it was what warriors do. The video you just heard could have ended differently. Margaret could have walked away. She could have accepted the extraction order, returned to active duty, and left Cedar Creek Medical to continue his crimes against 3 more patients before moving his operation to another city, another hospital, another collection of victims. But she didn't. She stayed. She held the line. And when the moment came to disarm a knife-wielding man storming the trauma bay, she walked toward the threat instead of running from it. That's what separated her from everyone else in that moment. That's what separated her from Whitfield. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in power, someone who used that position to humiliate you, subscribe to the channel. Like this video. Comment below with a time you stayed when you could have walked away. And don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss another story about the quiet ones who turn out to be legends.